Make sure we're recording. Okay, great. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's program, Comanches, Captives, Germans, and Transactions on the Texas Frontier, 1847, with Doctors Daniel Gelo and Christopher Wickham. I'm Maggie Onosorgan, the Public Program Manager here at the Amerind. And as usual, before we begin our program, we would like to acknowledge that the Amerind is located in southern Arizona on lands where the Otham, Hopi, Zuni, Yoeme, and Apache families have lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. We would also like to thank our members and donors who enable the Amerind to provide these free online programs and to fulfill Amerind's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, and conservation and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Amerind in supporting its missions and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. We do have more online talks in the works. We're a little bit behind. I apologize. We have both scholar and artist talks. So please watch our website for more details that will be coming soon. And as always, if you have suggestions of topics you would like to see or artists that you would like to hear about, we welcome suggestions. Just a reminder that today's recording will be sent to all our registrants and available to watch on our YouTube channel, the Amerind Foundation, later this evening after it's processed, along with all our past videos. And today, if you would like to ask any questions of Dr. Gelo or Dr. Wickham, please type them in the Q&A chat box, and we will try to get to as many as possible after their presentation. So today we are pleased to welcome back Dr. Daniel J. Gelo, who is the Dean and Professor of Anthropology Emeritus and former Stumberg Distinguished University Chair at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Dr. Gelo holds a PhD, master's, and BA degrees in anthropology from Rutgers University. His publications include Comanche Vocabulary, Comanches in the New West, 1896-1908 with Stanley Noyes, Texas Indian Trails with Wayne Patt, Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier, the Ethnology of Heinrich Berghaus with Christopher Wickham, and Indians of the Great Plains. He has won various awards, including Outstanding Teacher Award from the University of Texas System's Chancellor's Counselor and the Presidio La Bahia Award for the Best Book on Early Texas History. We are also welcoming back Dr. Christopher Wickham, who is Professor Emeritus of German at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He earned his PhD in German Studies and Literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a master's in German language and a BA in German and linguistics. He is taught at the, I'm probably gonna mess this up, Universität Regensburg, Germany, Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, and the University of Illinois at Chicago. Before teaching at the University of Texas, San Antonio, he is retired from teaching and now focuses his research on German literature and culture, and most recently on the interaction between German settlers and Comanches in the 19th century Texas. He authored a monograph on the dialect of Dendorf, Bavaria, 1987, and books on the notion of Heimat, 1999, and Comanches and Germans in Texas in 2018 with Daniel Gelo, which won, again, the Presidio La Bahia Award for Best Book on Early Texas History. Comanches, Captives, and Germans, a book co-authored with Dan Gelo, Hoppy Hopkins, and Bryden Moon, released in January 2023. He is currently working with Dan Gelo on a study of 19th century Texas botanist and newspaperman Ferdinand Lindenheimer. So with both their extensive knowledge, I will now turn it over to Dr. Gelo and Dr. Wickham. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Good morning. My name is Chris Wickham, and on behalf of Dan Gelo and myself, I would like to thank Maggie Oneshagen and Eric Kaldal for the invitation to present in the Amerind virtual lecture series. We're especially pleased to have the opportunity to present this project to this audience. And I will now bring up our PowerPoint. So if you'll bear with me for a second. There we go. In December 2020, Texas history enthusiasts Timothy Cook and Bob Phelps showed Hoppy Hopkins and Dan Gelo 3 finely worked pencil sketches dating back to the middle of the 19th century. The sketches seemed to be by the same artist and, with one exception, had never been published. Dan then shared the sketches with 2 other historians, and they were immediately very interested. Why? The sketches provided a detailed and unique view of the cultural encounter between Germans and Comanches in the Texas Hill Country. And in addition to that, 2 of them focused on the dramatic transfer of a captive girl from the Comanches to the Germans. Let me see if I can advance this then. We will examine some of the striking detail in the sketches and try to decode information the artist has placed in them. For your general geographic orientation, the Texas Hill Country shown here is the name for the extensive limestone plateau that lies to the north and west of the Balcones Escarpment. The escarpment runs roughly along Interstate 35, which connects San Antonio, New Braunfels, San Marcos, and Austin. Who was the girl in the drawings? Who were the Comanches involved? Who were the Germans? Where and when did this event take place? What do we make of the rich Indian and German cultural detail that the artist includes? And of course, who was the artist and how important is his work? Our talk traces the journey of discovery of our group of researchers as we looked for answers to these questions. The team consisted of Comanche specialist Hoppy Hopkins, Kendall County historian Bryden Moon, and the 2 of us, Dan Gelo, an anthropologist, and Chris Wickham, a German studies specialist. At one critical point, we had help from Llano County historian Glenn Hadler. We refer to the 3 sketches or drawings as drawing 1, drawing 2, and drawing 3. Drawing 1 shows a Texas hill country landscape populated with numerous human figures, horses, and an assortment of hunted game. In the center of the sketch, an Indian headman with a war bonnet holds a struggling girl, while a hatted man in European clothing seems set to receive her. A wall and shade tree are included at the left margin. A woman in European formal dress stands in the left foreground. Drawing 2 gives us a similar scene. However, here the transaction takes place left of center and the girl appears more animated. The point of view has shifted farther to the right. The tree and the woman in formal dress are missing. Drawing 3 has an entirely different theme. Here we see a train of ox-drawn wagons heading for a pass, with Indians watching on horseback and on the ground from an elevated vantage point. Again, we are dealing with Comanches and Germans in the Texas Hill Country, but the focus of attention here is on the settlers' wagons, and the Indians are observers. The historical setting for the drawings is the German colonization of central Texas during the 1840s and early 1850s. German immigrants populated the region under a colonization program organized by a society of noblemen in Germany known as the Adelsverein, the Verein zum Schutz deutscher Einwanderer in Texas. Though the Adelsverein project was fraught with poor planning, severe underfinancing, fiscal mismanagement, extreme physical hardship, and death, it did make it possible for German settlers to establish stable communities at New Braunfels in 1845 and Fredericksburg in 1846. From Fredericksburg, the settlers were positioned to move north across the Llano River into the Fisher-Miller Grant, a 3.9 million acre tract where the Adelsverein had purchased settlement rights. This enormous territory was as yet unoccupied by whites and home to potentially hostile native people belonging to several tribal groups, most notably Comanches. Essential for the success of the settlers seeking to occupy the Fisher-Miller Grant was a peace accord with the local Comanche bands belonging to the Southern or Penataca Division. This treaty was pursued and consummated by the second Adelsverein Commissioner General, John O. Moisebach. The nomadic Penataca bands favored the region between the Llano and Colorado rivers for its game, pecans, and winter horse pasturage, and they maintained regular campsites there. Moisebach and party explored the area in February and March of 1847 and met with Comanche headmen Tecumseh, Buffalo Hump, Old Owl, and Santa Ana. They negotiated a pact ratified 2 months later in Fredericksburg. In dealing with the Comanches, the Germans were more tolerant than Anglo settlers of that time, addressing the Indians as equals, inviting them to visit the German settlements regularly, and even acknowledging the eventual probability of language sharing and ethnic intermarriage. Among the immigrants was a distinct group formed in Germany by young university men planning to establish their own utopian colony of free thinkers. Originating in and around the Hessian city of Darmstadt, they migrated to Texas together in the summer of 1847 under the leadership of Dr. Ferdinand Herff and Hermann Spies, and they became known as the Darmstadt 40. After a staging period in New Braunfels, the Darmstadt 40 migrated in fall 1847 by ox wagon train across the Llano River and selected a site on the north side of the river, a mile or so downstream from present-day Castell. They named their commune Bettina in honor of the Italo-German writer, artist, and activist Bettina von Arnim. The Darmstadt 40 raised 200 bushels of corn their first season, but conflict arose over work responsibilities, and the Bettina community fell apart within a year. Members of the Darmstadt 40 returned to Germany or dispersed into other frontier communities. One of these men was the artist responsible for our 3 drawings. As we viewed the drawings, the identity of the artist or artists was not immediately obvious, but a box drawn in the lower right corner of drawing 2 contains a name and year neatly penned in a fraktur calligraphic hand that, despite some flaking of the paper, reads Friedrich and 1847 or 1849. The name Friedrich appears again in pencil script in the lower right corner of drawing 3. We searched published listings of the early German settlers around Fredericksburg, Texas, and only once did the surname Friedrich appear, and the identity of Wilhelm Friedrich was disclosed. Family law, passed down to the owners of drawing 2, confirmed Wilhelm Friedrich as the author of that work. This name is not a prominent one in the history of German settlement, and biographical information is scant, but the evidence is clear that Wilhelm Friedrich was a member of the Darmstadt 40 and a close associate of Dr. Ferdinand Herff. Wilhelm Friedrich was born in 1823, probably in Griedel, a district of the town of Butzbach in the Wetterau region of Hesse. The town lies 45 miles north of Darmstadt. And on this map, you can see Darmstadt in the bottom right corner, Butzbach upper right, city of Frankfurt am Main in between. To the southwest of Frankfurt, you see Mainz marked, and the Adelsverein was often known as the Mainzer Verein because that is where they were incorporated. You also see the name Braunfels underlined by a rather drunken red line there at the top of the map. Braunfels is a name you will hear in this presentation, but what you hear is New Braunfels, Neubraunfels, the Texas town. The town of Montabaur is also underlined on this map. That's because Montabaur is currently the sister city of Fredericksburg, Texas, and was the hometown of many of the immigrants. Like several of the Darmstadt 40, Wilhelm Friedrich attended the Höhere Gewerbeschule zu Darmstadt, the Darmstadt Vocational School, the forerunner of today's Technical University of Darmstadt. We're fortunate to have two of his handwritten grade reports from this school from the period 1840 to 1843. Friedrich's major is listed as Kameralist. Cameralism was a German social science focusing on aspects of public administration and containing prototypic elements of economics, statistics, public policy, and planning, and with the aim of producing enlightened bureaucratic administrators and officials. The handwritten comments by Friedrich's various teachers, though not always clearly decipherable, are at times prophetic. The one area where Friedrich was deemed exceptional was drawing, be it topographical, geometric, machine, or architectural. "Promises to become good," wrote Professor K in March of 1841. "Is developing very well in topographical drawing," wrote K later. The extant records do not confirm that Friedrich completed his course of study or graduated from the Darmstadt school, but we may assume he did because the 40s settlement proposal to the Adelsverein limited membership to those who had passed their exams and established themselves in their occupations. Friedrich arrived at the Bettina settlement in September of 1847, presumably with the founder's wagon train. His presence at Bettina is confirmed in Dr. Herf's recollections of the colony, where Herf named Friedrich among the hard-working and honest colonists who stood apart from those who soon became jaded with the enterprise and maneuvered to drop out. It may be assumed that he stayed at the commune for most of its existence, though there is no full account of his time there. After Bettina, Friedrich is found in New Braunfels, for a William Frederick, described as a laborer born in 1822 in Germany, is counted in that town in the US Census of September 1850. On May 15th of that year, Friedrich bought 400 acres west of today's downtown Burney. This well-watered property straddled the Camino San Saba, an ancient Indian and Spanish pathway that, together with the roughly parallel Pinta Trail to the east, connected San Antonio with Fredericksburg and points beyond. Here, Friedrich would be joined by a small group of former Darmstadt 40 members and other Germans, who with him built a compound for a new utopian settlement that predated the establishment of the town of Burney. The creek named for him is a feature of the Burney townscape today. Between 1854 and 1861, Friedrich made his living as a surveyor. As predicted by his teachers in Germany, Friedrich's draftsmanship was always more than a notch above the usual. An October 1860 survey he produced of some property in present northwest San Antonio is characteristically superb, preserving hitherto unknown detail of the linkage between the Camino Real and the Pinta Trail, routes which the German pioneers used to reach Fredericksburg. You see those marked as dotted lines on this illustration.
Who are the Indian people in Friedrich's sketches? We had little doubt from the outset that the Indians in the drawings are Comanches of the Panadoka or Honey Eater division. This was clear, first of all, because they were the dominant population in the area, the only one that could have mounted such a substantial showing of horsemen. And we know about their interactions with the Germans. And then there are details of dress and behavior that are shown in the drawings that we could count on to help us identify them. Now, when we look at the drawings, we see that the Indians are drawn in the same way for the most part. The men are bare-legged, not wearing leggings, just breech clouts. Their breech clouts and their upright head feathers, which seem sometimes to be held in headbands in drawing one, are not particularly realistic and often look more like the detailing seen in map cartouche Indians. No shirts, leather armor, or hairpipe breastplates that we might expect are shown. And only one of the men is not bare-legged. He wears leggings. Almost all the men hold lances. The long lance with a wooden shaft and metal point, often fashioned from a sword blade, was a prominent Comanche weapon during this period. In both drawings 1 and 2, one Indian man stands with his lance, his back turned to the viewer. In drawing 1, on the left near middle ground, one of the Indians near the end of the mounted ranks is waving ribbons or streamers above his head with his right hand while holding a lance with a skin or flag affixed to its end with his left hand. He appears to be signaling the other mounted Indians to ride in or assume a formation. Similar signaling with ribbons is performed by 3 men in drawing 3, while 3 others make signals by holding their lances aloft. Such communications were part of a large repertoire of long-distance signaling methods that the Comanches used, which included fire, smoke, blankets, skins, bird bone whistles, gestures with the shield or hand, and tight horse maneuvers. All of these kinds of signals were typically sent from high ground, as shown in drawing 3. It's also possible that the skin or flag on the lance in drawing 1 is a white one, as the Comanches were familiar with this conventional European peace signal and displayed it when greeting the Germans and other parties of white men. One or more of the human figures at the extreme right near middle of drawing 1, who are not holding lances, appear from their shape and status as casual spectators to be females. By extension, 1 or 2 of the figures in a similar position in drawing 2 could also be women. There is nothing, however, about the clothing of these figures that distinguishes them as females. Comanche women, after all, during this period wore dresses. The most prominent of these is the figure lounging like an odalisque in drawing 1, whose pose appears feminine, if only because of our familiarity with Western artistic convention. And this section of the drawing reminds us of various other expressions of this colonialist trope in depictions of Europeans meeting with native peoples, as in this case of an engraving of an expedition of Europeans visiting Hawaii just about 20 years before Friedrich did his drawings. And we found many other examples like this. Whether female or not, the reclining figure in drawing 1 and its companions face the main activity in the center and direct attention to it. In this function, they are balanced on the other side of the drawing by the man holding his horse and leaning nonchalantly against the tree. He serves as a kind of framing figure again customary in European art tradition. The white men and woman looking on in drawing 1 lower left corner also contribute to this framing function. The Indians' various activities in drawings 1 and 2 are typical of a large, bustling Comanche gathering. While some talk with the Germans or relax and look on, others in drawing 2 carry in game. More of them tend a herd of livestock, which are shown as frisky, unsaddled paint horses in drawing 2, and as docile horses or mules in drawing 1. Several form a perimeter of mounted men as if to assert control over the proceedings, and still others travel in the background. The numerous Indian men on horseback, lined up and equally spaced, either at rest or marching in, are impressive with their discipline and refinement, appearing no less civilized than the Germans in their orderly queue. And something like this behavior is described in several historical accounts. The detailing of Comanche horsemanship, including the form of the horses, the riding postures, and their tack, is really striking. The Indian horses are small relative to their owners, though sturdy, and care was taken to show spots on several of them, all characteristic of the paint horses preferred by the Comanches. Drawing 3 is most notable in recording one of the riding stunts for which the Comanches were renowned, as 2 riders balance on their horses' backs. Some of the horses have saddles or saddle pads. The horse in drawing 1, shown with splayed legs, has the most detailed saddle. Skillful penciling shows girths in both front and rear positions, no fenders or stirrups, and a small, simple seat with high cantle and pommel, indicating a saddle of Spanish-Mexican design or an Indian-made one on the Mexican model. The other Indian saddles match this style. On many of the horses, Friedrich took special care to draw a long rope trailing from the jaw. This was obviously an important detail for him. This is a characteristic piece of Plains Indian tack known as the war rein or war bridle, and Friedrich was astute in including it. The war rein was a single rawhide or buffalo hair rope tied around the bars of the horse's lower jaw, forming what is known as a jaw loop bridle. Held by the rider alongside the horse's neck, the rope was used as a rein to control the horse's movements. But while galloping, it could be dropped and allowed to drag so that the rider would have something to grab if he became dismounted. The knowledgeable frontier artist George Catlin drew a similar Comanche system in his sketch entitled Comanche Meeting the Dragoons. Friedrich shows another Comanche tack variation in drawing 3, where the man wearing a war bonnet and his companion peering over the ridge appears to handle split reins attached to hackamores or bosals, in other words, nosebands. Except for Catlin, Friedrich is alone among artists in the antebellum period for devoting so much attention to Comanche horses. Beyond the technical detail, he captures Comanche symbiosis with the animals and hints at the affection that individuals felt for their mounts. None of the livestock appears to belong to the Germans, with the important exception of the oxen and other wagon train animals in drawing 3. Here we see fine detail of a driver and his whip resembling a modern lunge whip, with equal length shaft and lash, held high as he walks along with the oxen, and his horse is held by another rider. One can see his empty saddle with its low, broad horn and sloping cantle that suggests, whether intentionally or not, a hope saddle, a forerunner of the Western-style saddles developed in Texas in the 1830s and commonly used up till today. There's plenty of other information in the sketches as well. Some of it is written. In drawing 1, almost imperceptible along the bottom of the woman's long skirt are some indistinguishable letters, perhaps 4, followed by HERF. No doubt this indicates that the woman depicted is Julie Herf, the lone adult female among the Batina settlers. Julie Herf, spelled with 1 F and no relation to Ferdinand Herf, who spelled his name with 2 Fs, was a German woman from Baden who had previously traveled in America and become fluent in English. She signed on with the Darmstadt 40 as a cook, housekeeper, and translator in Hamburg and went to live with them at the Batina commune. Drawing 3 has a legend on its bottom right corner that is much worn and possibly partly rewritten, but still refreshingly understandable. And it tells us what's happening in the picture. In all probability, it reads,
Auf dem Wege zum Rio Lano, den 25. September 1848, Friedrich.
On the way to the Rio Lano, September 25th, 1848, Friedrich. More noteworthy information is found in the depiction of slain animals in drawings 1 and 2, developed a bit differently in each. In drawing 1, the animals in the middle of the array are out of proportion, overly large in comparison to the humans near them, as if to emphasize them. Several of the animals have their bellies slit open. They have been field dressed, provided for the occasion as food or peltry. Among them are turkeys, deer, rabbits or hares, and large and small javelinas. This catalog of native species continues in the background of drawing 3, which is decorated with living animals, including bison, 2 of them butting heads, mustangs, deer, and a pack of 10 loping wolves or coyotes. I think they're probably wolves, given that they're ranging in a pack. And all of these are perfectly, if minutely rendered, and you can look, the fewest pencil strokes necessary to convey the character of each of those animals. Of special interest to naturalists is the depiction of 2 slain large spotted cats in drawings 1 and 2, which can only be jaguars. It's not commonly known that this species ranged so far northward in times past, but there are several written accounts of jaguars in Texas from the mid-19th century. However, Friedrich's drawings remain the only known pictorial evidence of jaguars in Texas prior to the 20th century. These animals, deer, jackrabbits, wild turkeys, javelinas, wolves, jaguars, elk, are interesting symbolically because they all, to the Germans, were new species or subspecies that are members of genera known from the Old World. So they are at once both familiar and exotic. And the Germans spent much energy writing to their relatives back home about the curious variations of animals that they knew from Germany, but found slightly differently in Texas. The animals were also a potent representation of the natural world that the Germans would need to conquer. And that same operation is underway in drawing 2, which shows slain deer being brought in by both Indians and Germans. The immediate intention, though, was not to tame the wilderness, but to mount a feast of goodwill. We could spend much more time looking at the details, all rendered exquisitely in miniature with single strokes and dots to show critical detail. The humans, ranging along with animal figures in the backs of drawings 1 and 2, for example. We see lines of travois, the mule-drawn A-frame drags that the Comanches used to transport their teepee poles, folded teepee covers, and worldly possessions, packed in rawhide suitcases called parfleches. The travois are proceeding in a single file, and their gentle pace contrasts with the frenetic riding of the of the men riding in and also the stationary mounts shown elsewhere in the pictures. Each travois mule has multiple children perched on its back and is led by a woman who is caretaker of the children and owner of the household goods, exactly as Comanches would have traveled while moving camp. You can see the children in the foreground, arms akimbo, walking along with their mothers. In their manner of execution and their position in the picture, these distant people are somewhat assimilated to nature, if not the animals themselves. They are moving through or inward from the background, part of the natural environment that the Germans were learning to deal with.
The non-Indian men are readily identifiable as German settlers because of their uniform depiction with long beards. In this period, as a rule, beards distinguished the Germans from Anglos. The Banatakas seized upon Moisebach's long red beard as his defining feature. Bettina settler Friedrich Schenk wrote to his mother in Germany in November of 1847 that the, quote, brown sons of the wilderness, end quote, referred to Germans as beard men. This term is probably a gloss of the Comanche word
Mozoraivo,
bearded white man. This is an old theme in tribal culture with a song and various stories about the wonder experienced when the Comanches saw men with beards for the first time. Along with beards, brimmed hats serve as an unfailing marker for the Germans. This convention mirrors Indian practice, though not knowingly, for among the Comanches and other Southern Plains Indians, the brimmed hat was the symbol for a white man, whether in pictography or sign language. And along with hats, the men all wear standardized pocketed coats and trousers extending down to their shoes, except for a few whose pants are tucked into their boots, a detail repeated in both drawing 1 and drawing 2. One more indication that the white men might be Germans appears in drawing 3, for their wagons are drawn by oxen. With some exceptions, the hill country Germans preferred oxen as draft animals, while Anglo settlers more frequently used horses or mules. Oxen were cheaper and more reliable than equines and not significantly slower. Also, Indians were much less tempted to steal oxen than horses. The Germans are engaged in several activities. Several of the men carry rifles, mostly leaning on them in a relaxed way. Many form a line as if waiting to greet the Indian chief. In the lower left of drawing 1, 4 men stand, squat, or lie as spectators. One gestures with his arm towards the central action while speaking to the woman we have identified as Julie Herf, whose style of dress indicates that she is the only white woman in any of the 3 pictures. He seems to be explaining what's going on.
Let's look at the captive in detail. The main action in drawings 1 and 2 involves an Indian man standing behind and holding a girl in Indian dress. The man is a chief, properly a band headman, indicated by his full feather war bonnet. He's the only person wearing one in drawings 1 or 2. The feathers from the immature golden eagle each stand for a brave deed, advertising the wearer's war record, in this case, a highly distinguished one. This style of headdress with 1 or 2 long trailers extending from the back of the crown all the way down the wearer's back to his heels is historically significant. It is generally thought that Comanches rarely wore feather war bonnets, and particularly these long trailer war bonnets, before the reservation period of the late 1800s, but here we have some evidence to the contrary. Now, corresponding to the war bonnets is a medallion hanging around the chief's neck. no doubt a peace medal of the kind presented to Indian leaders by various governments and companies, proudly worn as a status symbol. The chief's identity is open to informed speculation. The peace medal suggests that this person had been on a visit to Washington, D.C., and German geologist Ferdinand Raymer noted that Comanche headman Santa Anna had visited there just before his meeting with Moisbach. It's likely, though not verified, that Santa Anna was given a Presidential Peace Medal by James K. Polk during this visit. It would have looked like that. He and the other Penidoka leaders could have been given medals at the May Treaty signing as well, or earlier, as medals along with printed testimonials and canes and flags were common diplomatic gifts from all of the colonial powers and private traders. So a medal in the drawing cannot prove the wearer's identity. And furthermore, there are various descriptions of Santa Anna. Some say he was corpulent and moon-faced and not at all like the trim chief in Friedrich's drawing. So we don't know for sure who this was. And it's also plausible that Friedrich did not intend to draw a specific person, but simply an iconic or stereotypic figure of Penidoka leadership. That the female is less than fully adult is suggested by her height relative to the chief's. She rises about to his chest. She wears a dress with a full-length skirt drawn with cross-hatching that seems to represent some decoration or texture. Her clothing appears to be an Indian dress. The chief is in the posture of presenting the girl to the white men standing before them. The first impression might be that the girl is Indian and is reluctant to become a present to the visitors. The corollary assumption might be that if she were a captive, she would be eager to escape from the Comanches and join the whites. The literature, however, contains many examples of captives who resisted rejoining white society once they had become assimilated as Indians. And when the Comanches were driven to the reservation, many captives chose to continue living among them. It is likely that the girl in drawing 2, who you can see is leaning backwards forcefully, is struggling to stay with the Indians, not leave them. Friedrich's drawing appears to show her rearing back from the white men, not straining towards them.
The main action in drawing 1 and drawing 2 corresponds to documented events, but the historical records provide at least 2 different captive exchanges as possible inspirations. The first of these to consider is an incident that took place during the Moisebach Treaty Council in 1847. Ferdinand Raymer noted in his account, "We saw among the Comanches all kinds of movable articles stolen in Mexico, such as costly blankets, mules, horses, harnesses, etc. We also saw captured Mexican men, women, and children. Several of these had lived for so long a time among the Indians that they had no desire to return to their native land. They were therefore not treated as prisoners. A young Mexican woman with whom her master was dissatisfied was offered to us for the small sum of $40. Of the captive mentioned by Raymer, we do not know her name or whether the Germans actually purchased her. There's also no other mention of the young woman or of the incident specifically in the records of the Adelsverein. Much of what was going on that day, however, can be interpreted considering Joaquin Rivera Martinez's outstanding study of Comanche captives. In his sample of 773 documented captives whose destiny is known, some 15% were adopted into Comanche families with marriage and property rights and thus deeply assimilated, while 10% were ransomed. It was unusual for Comanches to give up a captive of their own initiative, and then almost always for a substantial ransom. Sometimes they did offer captives during peace negotiations. Since a treaty agreement with its inherent need to establish lasting bonds was the basis for the March 1847 convening, and since the ransom amount for the Mexican girl was only, in Raymer's words, a small sum, geringen Preis, there is some reason to believe that the Germans redeemed the girl. On the other hand, a young Mexican woman may not have wanted to go with the German strangers. If they did acquire her, the Germans would have adopted her or attempted to reunite her with her Mexican family. But there were reportedly other episodes involving the Germans and a Mexican Indian captive. These events are said to have taken place at the Bettina settlement or in New Braunfels. The accounts vary and must be treated systematically in order to reconcile them. The most frequently repeated story has its origins in Herf family oral history. The story goes that within a few weeks after the Bettina colony was started, Dr. Ferdinand Herf had become known to the Comanches as a healer, and they brought him a man with advanced cataracts. Herf had the proper instruments to perform an extraction and took on the procedure with some ingenious measures to put the patient under and ensure the necessary lighting and cleanliness. The operation proved a complete success. As he was leaving, the overjoyed patient promised to bring Herf a wife. The Germans did not take this remark seriously, but about 3 months later, according to this version, the Comanche man reappeared and left a captive teenaged Mexican girl. The girl was taken in by Julie Herf and, quote, years later made a happy marriage with Hermann Spies, end of quote. He was one of the organizers of the Darmstadt 40. Quite separate from the Herf family oral tradition and hardly known, Dr. Herf had also published his own reference to the surgery episode in a German newspaper, the Allgemeine Auswanderungszeitung. And this happened already in October of 1848. His newspaper article describes the time when the Darmstadt 40 were waiting in New Braunfels to depart for the Bettina location on the Lana River. It was then that the 40 first met Comanches. This was the group led by headman Santa Anna that was in New Braunfels to receive presents promised in the Moisebach Comanche Treaty. Herf's article gives personal names for several of the Comanches he met, which, except for Santa Anna, are otherwise unrecorded. Among these is Kevamoy, the group's medicine man. Herf then relates the doctor of the tribe, who, to begin with, just like the old colleagues in Europe, seemed to resent how young I was, sought help from me for his cataracts. With an imposing gesture, I predicted blindness in 6 months, but told him that I would then give him back the light of his eyes, which seemed to comfort him. And more generous than Santa Anna had been, he promised an honorarium consisting of 2 mules and a tzart Mexicano huepcha, a beautiful Mexican woman. This passage is interesting because it establishes that the surgery was arranged in New Braunfels, not at Bettina, as implied in the Herf family version of the story. Also, the patient is identified by name. It's further implied that the patient's offer of remuneration was first made at this time in New Braunfels and not after the operation was completed. The payment here includes livestock as well as a captive for a wife. Herf's Comanche is quite accurate.
Jot, Mexicano, what? A good, fine, or pretty Mexican woman.
At the same time, Herf's newspaper account does not confirm that the surgery was actually performed at Bettina or anywhere else, nor does it reveal whether the Germans acquired a captive as a result of this transaction, or if the captive was named Lena. There is, however, an alternative story about the origin of Lena or Lina Spies. We find versions of it in a 1968 New Braunfels newspaper article about a visit to the town by Spies's grandson, Walter Spies, and in an unsigned biography of Lena Spies entitled The Exile. Both of these sources are archived in the personal papers of Hermann Spies. They speak of a Mexican girl captured by Comanches who was redeemed by German settlers, raised in a convent, and by members of the German community near New Braunfels, and who eventually married Hermann Spies. These two accounts of Lena Spies' origins from the Spies papers conform in some interesting ways to the recollections of botanist and newspaper editor Ferdinand Lindheimer. And he penned then between 1876 and 1879, so a good 30 years later. Lindheimer writes that the Darmstadt colony, that is Bettina, received a very young Mexican girl from the Indians, quote, for a hand vice and some files, end quote. She was placed in the care of Lindheimer's wife and later married Hermann Spies. Careful analysis of Lindheimer's travels in Texas, collecting plant specimens, and comparison of this itinerary with other information show that this meeting probably took place in Bettina and during the late summer of 1848, shortly before the Bettina settlement was abandoned. When arrayed together and weighed in terms of their immediacy, these disparate accounts are not incompatible. They establish probable circumstances that can be summarized as follows. Firstly, the Germans had other interactions with Comanches concerning captives, in addition to the captive presentation at the Moisebach Treaty Council recorded by Remer. Santa Anna was involved in all of these additional episodes. One of these interactions involved Dr. Ferdinand Herff. Herff made the arrangement for his celebrated cataract surgery, with curious payment tendered, while still in New Braunfels. In all likelihood, he performed the operation some weeks later at Bettina. He may have received a captive as payment for his medical services. If he did, her delivery could have coincided with the November 1847 Comanche visit to Bettina, although her delivery has been described as a casual, individual gesture by the grateful patient and not part of any large event, such as that depicted in Drawing 1 and Drawing 2. Nevertheless, it's not independently substantiated in primary written sources that this transfer actually took place, even though eyewitnesses who documented the event were in a good position to do so. The story of Herff's interaction with the cataract patient Kevamoy appears to have been conflated with the story of Lena Spies. Lena was purchased, not received as a payment or gift. She was ransomed by Hermann Spies and Ferdinand Lindheimer in some joint effort, perhaps including other Germans too. Unlike the putative Herff transaction, this one took place during the final days of the colony and clearly involved a group of Indian visitors. As Bettina dissolved, Lena was taken to New Braunfels and raised for the next 3 years in a series of foster situations involving several of the notable citizens of the German community there. Her death notice indicates that she married Spies in 1851 at about age 15. It's tempting to wonder if the Mexican girl in the Herff or Spies and Lindheimer accounts was the same one offered several months earlier at the Moisebach Treaty Council mentioned by Ferdinand Remer. There's no documentary evidence to this effect. In any case, it is significant that while several photos exist of redeemed Comanche captives, Friedrich's drawings are the only known period images of a Comanche captive made while the person was in captivity. Our book on Friedrich's drawings discusses specific hill country sites as possible locations for Friedrich's drawings, but there is another possibility that we must entertain, namely that Friedrich's Drawing 1 and Drawing 2 are not exact depictions of a single place or event, but rather creative composites with commemorative intention. They could be hybrids of the Moisebach Treaty and Bettina locations and events, or others, all with a healthy measure of artistic license. According to this interpretation, Friedrich's purpose was not photographic, but didactic and memorial. In their contrived but not deceptive quality, the three drawings might be called artistic historical fiction. Friedrich developed a novel approach to representing the pioneer experience by focusing on cultural interaction, turning it into an Indian pioneer experience. This move is most evident in drawing 3, which privileges the Indian viewpoint on the very arrival of the German settlers. Even considering that some of Friedrich's immediate audience members were cultivated, he was forcing his original viewers, and continues to force us, to adopt an unexpected perspective. Friedrich's manipulation of perspective by showing human figures from the back represents an experimentation in viewpoint. Friedrich establishes a rational and observational rather than an emotional connection between his viewers and the people and environment that he depicts. These artistic achievements are very much in keeping with Friedrich's technical training and with the German colonists' commitment to objectivity and human rights.
What became of our artist, and what is his legacy? On February 18th of 1860, William Friedrich, so-called, married Alice Andre, a woman of English birth, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in San Antonio. They went on to have 2 daughters named Charlotte Matilda and Alice Louise. In 1861, with Civil War approaching, Friedrich had the idea of setting up a gunpowder factory in San Antonio to supply the Confederacy. His new concern prospered for a while, but declined as competing powder factories grew up around the South during the war, and then the conflict wound down. Finding himself under serious financial strain at that point, he moved in with the Herf family temporarily. Friedrich continued to run the plant after the war ended. But about December 20th of 1868, Friedrich's factory was the scene of a massive explosion. All 13 of his workers were killed instantly, and Friedrich suffered horrific burns over 80% of his body. He lay in agony for 3 days under the constant care of an anguished Dr. Herf before passing on December 23rd. The Herfs saw to it that their dear friend was buried next to their son Baldwin, who had died tragically as a toddler. Ferdinand Herf and his wife would eventually rest there too. Their gravestones can be found all together in San Antonio City Cemetery number 1. A person of Wilhelm Friedrich's interests and vision was likely to have had some idea of the coming developments initiated by the Darmstadt 40 and their fellow German settlers. He lived to see the towns they founded or populated in the area in and around the Fisher-Miller Grant, Fredericksburg, Castell, Burney, Comfort, Mason, Llano, all become viable and at times prosperous communities. And by the early 1850s, Friedrich would have realized that however marvelous it was, the Moisbach-Comanche peace would not protect the Pennaducas from the onslaught of settlement. Friedrich probably would not, however, predicted that the few of his own sketches meant to exercise his love of drawing and entertain and inform some friends would expand greatly our knowledge of Comanche ethnology and the German Indian experience and secure his legacy as a significant figure in documenting the history of Central Texas frontier settlement. This concludes the formal part of our presentation, except to say that the full story of our work, and there are many other details that might interest you, are published. The story is published as a book by State House Press, shown here, Comanches, Captives, and Germans. Again, we acknowledge the contributions of our co-authors, Hoppy Hopkins and Bryden Moon, on this project. The book includes original cover art by Native American painter Brandon Bailey that uses motifs taken from Friedrich's drawings. So Chris and I thank you for your attention, and at this time we can field any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dan and Chris. We do have a few questions. I'll start at the beginning. Please share your experience with tribal consultation during your research process on tribes and share any lessons learned about the process. Thank you.
I suppose the responsibility for that fell mainly on me as an anthropologist who has worked with the Comanche people since 1982. And I have an ongoing conversation with several elders in the tribe who themselves are descendants of many of the people that are documented in these early records. And also at times when it's appropriate to do so with the tribal historian, the official person appointed by the tribal government. And those conversations are on an ongoing basis, and they're made aware of our research. We had a wonderful opportunity with the recent anniversary of the town of Fredericksburg to visit directly with the Comanche contingent that came down to help the descendants of the German settlers celebrate that anniversary. We had a long weekend of hospitality shown by the town of Fredericksburg to the Comanche people who visited, and they performed traditional dances, and much discussion of this recent project was shared with them at that point. So we see that it is, while it is not a product of their writing directly, that it is informed by their memories and understanding of their own traditions. And they typically enjoy the discoveries that we make down here in Texas. The Comanche people living in Oklahoma, where they were relocated in the 1800s, and now most of them live up there, they have a great fondness for Texas and the history of this region and continue to maintain contacts with people in the state and continue to pursue their history and their love of the land here in Central Texas.
So did their descendants add to the stories about the exchanges of captives or in any way?
Well, one of the things that we're finding, and this is a kind of a nagging question in several research projects I've been involved in, the Peniduka division of Comanches was expelled from Texas relatively early, by 1859. They actually preceded the other Comanches to be relocated in Oklahoma. And as a result of that, there are not really dependable memories that have been handed down among the people, at least not that we've been able to discover, about specific events. So while the people were certainly familiar with the idea of captives, and they knew many captives' names and so forth, we didn't find anyone who knew about this particular episode.
Great, thank you. And a question from Samuel. Is it fair to suppose that in the mid-1800s, there were Comanche in Texas that spoke their native language, Spanish, German, and perhaps English as well?
Well, absolutely. We don't know much about the penetration of German into Comanche, and we've been on the lookout for that. And Chris will help me remember, but I don't believe we've found any confident examples of that. But modern Comanche contains quite a bit of Spanish and English, typically for words that accompanied introduced objects. So for bread, Comanche people may say tortilla, which is tortilla. Huarache is the Comanche word for sandal, from huarache, which is Spanish. Binica is the Comanche word for petticoat, which is something I guess they saw white people wearing. So you can see the influence of those languages very strongly. And remember, the Comanches were in contact with Spanish for a couple of hundred years, you know, it was very intensive exchange opportunity for exchange. So a lot of the early Anglos communicated with the Comanches in Spanish. And the Comanche language itself was used among different tribes besides the Comanches as a trade language. So when the settlers learned Comanche, it helped them talk to members of other tribes as well.
This might also be an opportunity to refer to work we did on a Comanche dictionary from 1851. This is the first large Comanche dictionary, or Comanche dictionary of any substance, which is actually a Comanche German dictionary. It was published in Germany in an academic article in 1851. There's no evidence that this dictionary, as we call it, was published in Texas or was used as a way to assist Germans in communicating with Comanches. The informant who worked with a Comanche in order to write out the list of words refers to working with Santa Anna, the headman, and says that Santa Anna spoke Comanche, obviously Spanish, and some poor English, but not German.
Okay. And a more contemporary language question from Julie. Hasn't the term Indian been replaced with indigenous or native?
Not necessarily. It depends on the context. Some people prefer to say indigenous or Native American. Chris and I tend to use all three in our writings. Today we use the word Indian quite a bit. I will say that when I'm in the Comanche community in Oklahoma, the people typically refer to themselves not as Native American or indigenous, but as Indians. So we don't feel that that's inappropriate.
Thank you. And one from Carolyn. I may have missed it, but what are the size of the drawings?
I had the inches written down and I don't have it handy, but they're actually rather small. They're about this big.
Oh, okay. And one from Dessa. Were the Germans of Amish religion, or do you know? But Amish would have had families.
There's no indication that they were Amish. The Darmstadt group that we talk about at some length, and this is the group that Wilhelm Friedrich belonged to, were known as free thinkers, which basically means that they did not adhere to any organized religion and therefore cannot be categorized as Catholics, Protestants, or anything else. In Fredericksburg, in fact, the first church that was founded as a Vereinskirche, which is to say it was the church of the Society of Noblemen. It belonged to the administration and did not have a denominational affiliation. Later on, of course, churches were built specifically for the Catholic community, for Protestant community, and so on. In another hill country town, Comfort, which was also founded by freethinkers, there was no church for a long time. And the first church was really only built under pressure from tourists to Comfort, who were coming from San Antonio and other urban centers for the good air and the open spaces of the hill country. And they found that they needed churches in order to feel at home and to feel comfortable. And so churches began to be built in Comfort at that time. And that really comes about the same time that the railway arrives in Comfort. So while there certainly were among the German immigrants who came to the hill country, Catholics and Protestants, a significant impulse in that immigration move also came from these so-called free thinkers.
Interesting. And one from Maryland. Did someone introduce the Germans to the Comanches? How did the relationship of the two groups develop?
Well, as Dan indicated, the relations have remained very good up until the present day, with groups of Comanches visiting from Oklahoma when Fredericksburg celebrated its 175th anniversary just a couple of years ago. The relations between Germans and Comanches in that particular area was amicable. There are isolated records of German immigrants being killed by Indians after the date of the Moisebach-Comanche Treaty in 1847, but there is no evidence that the perpetrators of those murders were members of the Penataka band, because there were other tribes who operated in that area as well. And so generally speaking, the relationship between the German immigrants and the Comanches remained good and has remained good up to the present day. Of course, the Germans are today very interested in Native American culture. There are many Native American societies in Germany, and people relish both academic research into Native American life and culture, as well as more romantic aspects. And that is a thriving, one may say, pastime in Germany to this day. And because of the interest, the academic interest, and the specific detailed interest in cultural matters, much of that attention is devoted to the Comanches.
Right. We have time for one more last question. One from Rod. The settlements appear to have occurred during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. What was the interaction?
Well, again, there was a very important impact of the Mexican-American War, because just as the boatloads of German immigrants were arriving on the Texas coast, either in Galveston or at Indianola, also known as Karlshafen, the U.S. Army, of course, Texas had joined the United States by that time, the U.S. Army requisitioned all wagons and transportation, so that it became very difficult for the Germans to get from the coast inland, either to New Braunfels, which was really a staging point initially for immigrants seeking to get to the Fisher-Miller Grant to settle land north of the Llano River, and also Fredericksburg. So there was a very direct impact in that sense. Also, many individual Germans joined the U.S. Army and served as U.S. military in the war with Mexico and received benefits, such that for research purposes, those pension records are actually quite useful to us these days in finding out more about what happened to individual German immigrants.
Well, we're past our time, so I'm going to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you both for sharing your knowledge. And I will let you close out with any closing words. Thank you again, everyone.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to present our work to this audience. Thank you to those who submitted questions and stimulated us to continue our inquiries in particular directions.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.